tonight we're dealing with a historical figure, one of great importance in American foreign policy history. The Council very seldom has these kind of programs. We don't emphasize the historical very often. We deal with major questions that are right in front of us. But this evening we're going to, our guest is going to talk about Senator Vandenberg of Michigan, critical congressional figure during the creation of that period of time that people know as the Truman era of foreign policy, a set of policies and conceptions which guided American foreign policy for at least 40 years and now have changed a little bit. But the fact is it was a very important part of our history. It remains so because it also is a transition from American non-involvement in foreign affairs, except for trade and the like, to a very deep involvement. So it's a critical historical period, which is of great interest for that reason. And also many people observe, of course, that there are some behaviors in the present American political area which could be informed by some of the attitudes toward compromise that were so well represented by Senator Vandenberg. Our guest has studied Senator Vandenberg for a considerable length of time. He's an amateur historian in a sense, if I may. I had a conversation the other night with the husband of one of our members who's a retired professor of political science, and he told me that he's a investment advisor, so he sends out a note to his clients every quarter, and then he tacks on to it an essay. And I read one of them the other day. It's a marvelous essay. It's a wonderful treatment of the approach to guerrilla warfare, which is a topic that we've dealt with on a number of occasions. A wonderful thing. And it reminds one of how running through the entire history of our society and further back into European life, where the apparently amateur historian, commentator, poet, playwright has been absolutely critical to our civilization. And so our guest tonight is of that ilk. And if you haven't read reviews of his book, you probably should. They're marvelous. And his work is treated as serious history, making a contribution of note to both statesmen and students alike. His first book was on his grandfather, Hendrik Meijer, of the same name, who founded Meijers, which is largely a grocery chain today in the United States. It was grocery and department stores at one time.
Actually, still is. But
Still is. All right. And it used to be called. Wasn't frugality. What was
Meijer Thrifty Acres.
Thrifty.
I wrote that down when I was a kid.
Thrifty Acres was the first name, and our guest tonight wrote a biography of his grandfather and his establishment of that particular firm. There are now 235 Meijers stores throughout the Midwest. It's a substantial enterprise. Our guest serves as executive chairman of it, and at the same time has managed to carve out over the last couple of decades an absolutely remarkable biography, which is going to be educational this evening for all of us. It's a great pleasure to present Hendrik Meijer.
Well, thank you so much, Frank, and it is a real delight and I want to thank you for entertaining a biographer with a historical perspective when I was reviewing some of the distinguished speakers you've had. It's pretty humbling to be a grocer from Grand Rapids and to be a part of that. But I do have to, just in the name-dropping era, I see that one of your regular speakers is David Mike Lampton from Johns Hopkins. And Mike and I have both been involved with the Kettering Foundation and have gone to China a couple of times together. So some of what I learn about world affairs comes from some of the same sources that you rely on. But I'm going to take us way back tonight in a story that begins at the beginning of the 20th century, when a teenager just out of Grand Rapids Central High School fell under the sway of the most exciting politician of that era in 1900, Theodore Roosevelt. Arthur Vandenberg was born in Grand Rapids in 1884, the son of a harness maker who nearly went broke when Arthur was 9 years old. So the boy was showing his entrepreneurial stripes early, starting a delivery business between a shoe factory and the railroad depot, trying to support his family. And he was something of a prodigy in government studies. He claimed he'd been reading the congressional records since he was 14. I have no research to support that, but he clearly was passionate from a very young age about the way our system worked. And his first job after graduating from college, though, was working at a biscuit factory. And he was fired the day he left his desk to join a campaign parade for the charismatic young governor of New York, Teddy Roosevelt, who came to town in the fall of 1900 as a candidate for vice president on the ticket with William McKinley. And Vandenberg was fired when he got back for going AWOL, but he was also inspired to go find his next great love, which was a job in the newspaper business. He was hired as a cub reporter for the Grand Rapids Herald. Soon became the paper's most prolific reporter, covering the police beat and City Hall, and his first byline while he was still a teenager was a big story on the Electoral College. Now, young Vandenberg was a regular Republican when the city and the state, and really an awful lot of the country outside the South, was mostly Republican. And he was not yet 22 years old when the longtime editor of the paper died, and its owner, Republican Senator William Alden Smith, notable chiefly for having conducted the hearings into the sinking of the Titanic in the caucus room in the old Senate office building, tapped him to be editor. And after World War II, Vandenberg fought for reservations to Senate approval of American membership in the League of Nations. So now we're talking about a young editor of a Midwestern newspaper in his early 30s, trying to find a compromise between supporters of President Woodrow Wilson, who refused to make any changes, of course, to the League covenant that he'd negotiated in the peace talks at Versailles, and his opponents, led by Republican Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Henry Cabot Lodge, on one side, and by William Borah and the Irreconcilables, who were opposed to any kind of having anything to do with the League, on the other. Vandenberg would send Lodge and a lot of other Republicans his editorials, both to impress them, but also to influence them. And Lodge wrote back in reply to one, "I'm going to steal your line. Unshared idealism is a menace." And Vandenberg also wrote presidential candidate Warren Harding's foreign policy speeches, and then 3 books inspired by Vandenberg's boyhood hero, Alexander Hamilton. Unfortunately, he was a little ahead of his time here, so he wasn't able to capitalize on that passion, but he was inspired by Hamilton's story of the outsider who arrives in the Capitol in Washington and helps create the Republic. While he was an editor, he also railed against one of Baltimore's most famous natives, H.L. Mencken. Now, he had defended Mencken in the Hat Rack case when American Mercury magazine was censored by the Massachusetts Attorney General for publishing a story about a prostitute. But later, when Sinclair Lewis publishes his novel Babbitt, which satirizes a Midwestern, middle-brow, middle-class businessman in a city that was of Zenith, based probably on Cincinnati, but it could have been on Grand Rapids. Mencken elevates that term Babbitt to attack a certain frame of mind that he sees as mediocrity in American life. And Vandenberg takes umbrage at that. He writes an editorial saying, "Spare us the best of Babbitt." spare me the company of the Menkenses and the Lewises. Later he'll change his mind, but that was the framework that he had as an editor. And at the same time that he was beginning to make a name for himself on the national stage. Well, he was preparing to chase his dream and run for the United States Senate in 1928 when the incumbent Democrat died and he was appointed to the seat. So expectations were high when Arthur and his wife Hazel arrived in Washington. And he was eager to work with the new Republican president, Herbert Hoover, who was certainly a moderate enough Republican, but someone Vandenberg was comfortable with. But even though Hoover was a brilliant engineer and administrator and famously provided relief after the Great War, he'd never held elective office, and he lacked finesse, to say the least, working with Congress. And then the stock market crashed in 1929, and that doomed his presidency. So then Vandenberg tries to work with Franklin Roosevelt after Roosevelt's landslide victory in 1932. And he's a savvy politician in a state that's beginning to turn purple, and he's ready in a time of national emergency to cooperate with the Democratic administration. So he supports some of the early New Deal remedies for a crippled economy. And he has one of his own: savings deposit insurance to protect small depositors and save the nation's banks. And Detroit was the site of the first great banking crisis after the stock market crash. And so in 1932, and Vandenberg is trying to work with Hoover and his Secretary of the Treasury, as there are two big Detroit bank holding companies on the verge of collapse. And he proposes deposit insurance then, but Hoover fights him on it. And then when FDR comes in, FDR does too. But Vandenberg lines up the votes in the Senate, and a new law creates the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, Roosevelt claimed to see the value of it, and somewhat to Vandenberg's chagrin, was all too happy to claim credit for what might have been the most successful of all New Deal legislation, but it was the brainchild of Arthur Vandenberg. As the reach of federal power grew, however, Vandenberg tried to draw a good Republican distinction between being social-minded and socialistic, and he broke with Roosevelt over executive rulemaking that he regarded as too intrusive. And he styled himself as a vigilante when he thought the New Deal was overstepping the Constitution, and certainly couldn't abide Roosevelt's attempts to tinker with the Supreme Court because it had rejected some of the president's legislation. So this hardening of Vandenberg's opposition to FDR was coinciding with world events that posed new dangers. The rise of Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, of course, threatened peace in Europe, and the Japanese War Cabinet had ordered an invasion of China. In the face of these threats around the globe, Vandenberg fell back on what was for him first principle. He recalled Washington's farewell address, written by his hero, Hamilton, warning the young republic to avoid taking sides when the European powers collide. Let there be no entangling alliances, Washington had warned. And to Vandenberg, that meant one thing: American neutrality. And that was a conviction that was reinforced by his service on the Nye Committee, which had been investigating the causes of the Great War. Again and again, Vandenberg led the Senate isolationists who stymied Roosevelt's attempts to aid the European democracies before the war. In September 1939, however, debates about neutrality took on a new urgency when German bombers filled the skies over Warsaw and German tanks rolled into Poland. Over a national radio hookup from a baseball field in Grand Rapids, Vandenberg declared, "This is not our war." And before it became our war, with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, he led the band of isolationists in the Senate, mostly Republicans, but Democrats too, who fought Roosevelt every step of the way. They distrusted him, fearing that American boys would be pulled into combat in another distant war. The isolationists fought and lost the fight to keep the arms embargo of the 1937 Neutrality Act, which had been an outgrowth of the Nye Committee that he'd helped create. And they fought and lost a fight over Lend-Lease, the deal giving destroyers to the British Navy. Roosevelt was their nemesis, and Arthur Vandenberg was their organizing spirit. If you've seen the new Winston Churchill movie, Darkest Hour, there's that not particularly accurate phone call that Churchill makes to Roosevelt pleading for the release of, in this case, airplanes that the British had ordered from American manufacturers, and Roosevelt talking about how his hands were tied. Well, it was Vandenberg who was leading the fight to tie his hands at that time. And back in 1936, Vandenberg had avoided Kansas Governor Alf Landon's attempt to draft him as his vice presidential running mate, which of course turned out to be a very smart move when FDR carried every state except Maine and Vermont. And curious aside, Landon's running mate turned out to be Frank Knox, who later was Roosevelt's Secretary of the Navy. Knox had gotten his start in journalism in the same city room at the Grand Rapids Herald as Vandenberg. Moved on from there, but the two were friends from their youth. But in the run-up to 1940, Vandenberg was viewed as one of the leading Republican candidates for the Republican nomination. In fact, in 1938, the FBI opened an office in Grand Rapids, and when the agent was sent to Grand Rapids and was asked about his new assignment, he said he'd been told he'd been sent there to keep an eye on Arthur Vandenberg. So a little piece of trivia at a time when we once again are worried about the political implications of the FBI's activities. I was told this by an elderly former editor in Grand Rapids, and had every reason to believe him when he said that that was the reason the FBI would have opened an office in a smaller Midwestern city in the Depression, hardly a hotbed of organized crime. And then I was talking with a retired FBI agent just a few weeks ago, and who'd heard me mention this, and he said, well, that's interesting because FBI structure that some of you may be familiar with, they have divisional offices, 56 of them around the country in all the largest cities. So there's 5 in California, and in the Midwest there's 1 in Chicago and 1 in Detroit and 1 in Milwaukee. And then they have what are called resident agents in smaller cities who report through those divisional offices that report directly into headquarters in Washington. This retired agent said, my colleagues and I couldn't figure out why in the world the Grand Rapids office was set up in 1938 as a divisional office, reporting directly to J. Edgar Hoover, which would seem to corroborate the fact that that's why they were there. And I was just talking to him subsequent because he went back and checked when it ceased to be that divisional office with the direct pipeline to Washington. Turns out it was it moved to report to Detroit in July of '45. So that's just a couple of months after Franklin Roosevelt died. So it's kind of an interesting coincidence. But Vandenberg and his isolationist colleague, Robert Taft, of whom Dr. Bird is a particular expert, were swept aside in 1940, along with their traditional isolationist point of view, by a charismatic lawyer, Wendell Willkie, whose willingness to intervene in Europe nearly matched Roosevelt's. And Pearl Harbor made Vandenberg's isolationism look obsolete, and America was soon all in a global war. As the war began to turn in favor of the Allies, however, in 1943, and the Allies, of course, were called by Franklin Roosevelt the United Nations, the Republicans faced 2 big questions. One was partisan. Wendell Willkie was what might be today called a rhino. He'd been a Democrat before he ran for the Republican nomination. He had never held elective office. He was regarded by most of the GOP establishment as an opportunistic interloper. Now, any comparison to the present day will start to get very confusing. But his nomination also reflected a deep schism in the party, one that is still with us today, between isolationists or unilateralists on the one hand and internationalists, or those who believe in global cooperation, on the other. If the Republicans were going to have a chance at the presidency in 1944, these factions needed to come together. But how? The other question on the minds of Americans of all political stripes was, what would the world look like after the war? and what role should the United States play in it? Would we retreat again, as we did after World War I? Back then, Vandenberg's editorials had faulted Wilson and the League of Nations. Now the question was whether and how nations might again try to organize themselves to avoid future catastrophes. And Franklin Roosevelt wasn't saying. Senators and congressmen and Americans at large and editorial writers had all kinds of ideas. Bills were bubbling up in congressional committees. But FDR was Dr. Win the War. When Democrats in Congress tried to introduce resolutions on the House or the Senate, he quashed them. He didn't want to rock the boat, and he had a good reason to. He didn't want to risk alienating our allies. The Soviets had their own designs on their neighbors. The British had an empire they hoped to reclaim after the war. And so talking about post-war planning too soon was going to inevitably bring up questions that might create more tensions in the alliance. And then Franklin Roosevelt was pretty much a one-man band in foreign policy. In fact, his State Department was often on the sidelines. And for those of you who've read a lot about that era, when there were important missions to London or Moscow, it was Harry Hopkins who met with Churchill or Stalin, not the diplomats in the State Department. To answer that first question about Republican unity, the GOP called a meeting of its leading elected officials, so that they could exclude Willkie, to be held at the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island in Michigan over Labor Day weekend in 1943. And Vandenberg was chosen to chair the foreign policy group challenged to find common ground. Not for the first time, he looked for a middle way. In this case, between the isolationists, who wanted nothing more than to wash their hands of the world and bring the troops home after the war, and many of these were his longtime friends and political allies, and Willkie's followers, who held varying ideas about world federalism and international police force, and certainly a revived League of Nations. Republicans came out of that meeting at the Grand Hotel with a statement they could run on and an expression of support for some sort of world organization hedged about with all kinds of qualifiers about protecting American sovereignty. But that very statement of support went beyond anything that Roosevelt had allowed the Democrats to offer or that he was offering himself. And so the wonderfully ambiguous, grandly named Mackinac Charter set the stage for things to come. When I succeeded in putting 49 prima donnas together, Vandenberg told Henry Luce of Time magazine, and it certainly took one to know one, I discovered the necessary formula. And for Vandenberg, compromise was coming to be almost an art form. He was moving slowly away from isolationism. Pearl Harbor obviously played a part. In fact, he said that ended isolationism for any thinking person that day. That was way too simplistic. But it was certainly a demonstration that we were no longer safe behind our oceans. And so did his nephew, Hoyt Vandenberg, an Air Force general and student of modern warfare who had been in London for the Battle of Britain and would drop by Uncle Arthur's apartment on Connecticut Avenue on a Sunday afternoon to talk strategy in the kitchen. Now, Vandenberg's mistress, probably planted by British intelligence, probably had much less influence, but it's fun to mention that and speculate a little. By contrast, he relished the favorable press response to the Mackinac Charter as the GOP suddenly grabbed the spotlight in advancing support for what would become the United Nations. Even as he was moving in this new direction, though, his own change was chiefly behind the scenes, and most of the public still thought of him as the voice of isolationism. That changed on January 10th, 1945. The Allies were winning the war, closing in on Japan island by island, pushing across the Rhine into Germany. And a weary Roosevelt, in poorer health than anyone knew, was about to leave for the Russian resort of Yalta on the Black Sea to meet with Stalin and Churchill to talk about what to do as the collapse of the Third Reich drew near. Vandenberg was worried. He didn't trust Roosevelt. Neither he nor his colleagues knew what the three leaders would be deciding or what deals FDR might commit to on our behalf. So he felt he had to speak up. He needed to write a speech, and on January 10th, he rose in the Senate to propose a post-war security treaty among the victorious Allies to ensure that Germany would never again wage war on its neighbors. Boom. This was the Senate's leading isolationist calling for an American commitment to an entangling alliance with countries that had fought 2 world wars in the last 3 decades. It was, one correspondent said, the speech heard round the world. Now, that correspondent was James Reston, who also read a draft of the speech and may have been the one suggesting the post-war alliance, but Vandenberg got advice from a lot of people. But it was a renunciation of beliefs he had espoused for 25 years. When asked about Vandenberg's speech, FDR spoke dismissively, but the White House made a hasty request for 50 copies before the president departed for Yalta. Within months, the world and Vandenberg's place in it changed quickly. Roosevelt returned from Yalta knowing that he had no choice if he was to avoid Woodrow Wilson's fatal mistake with the League of Nations after World War I, other than to appoint Vandenberg, the leading Republican voice on foreign policy, as a delegate to the conference to be convened in May 1945 in San Francisco to create the United Nations. Then Franklin Roosevelt died, and Vice President Harry Truman had had lunch once with the president. He was a neophyte in foreign affairs, although a decisive one. He quickly announced that the UN meeting would move ahead. Since Roosevelt had often worked around the State Department in crafting foreign policy, his new young Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, was a marginal player. And Vandenberg's Democratic counterpart in the delegation, Foreign Relations Chairman Tom Connally of Texas, was a canny old politician, but of limited range. And that left Vandenberg, the Republican who'd come round to speak out first in favor of such an organization, to emerge as the most influential American delegate. And when it came time to sit down with the other powers in the penthouse of the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, to design what Vandenberg liked to call the town meeting of the world, his opinion and that of the Soviet Foreign Secretary Molotov seemed to be the ones that counted most. Historians can have all kinds of wonderful ideas about when the Cold War began, and there's going to be no right answer to that. But you could argue that one of the first was this confrontation in the penthouse when they're arguing about veto powers. That penthouse meeting was essentially what became the Security Council. They're arguing about veto powers and arguing about regional alliances. And this is the Russians and the Americans debating rather vociferously, well, the war is still going on. And so in the minds of the American public, we recognize the enormous sacrifices that the Russians are making in the war, and they are our allies. We're about to link arms across the Elbe. And so a great propaganda and genuine emotion is around our countries being brothers in arms. But in San Francisco, that's starting to come apart as the in post-war intentions clearly are about to diverge. With help from Nelson Rockefeller, the young Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, Vandenberg made sure that the UN Charter allowed for regional security arrangements so that with the Monroe Doctrine, the US and its Latin American neighbors could have a mutual defense treaty. And he made sure there would be enough Republicans on board in the Senate to approve the charter when it landed in their laps. President Truman needed him. After the charter was ratified, the president asked Vandenberg and Connally to play an unprecedented role in diplomacy. For starters, they were appointed as American delegates, 2 of the 4 American delegates, along with Stettinius and Eleanor Roosevelt, to the first General Assembly of the UN in London later that year. And actually kind of a wonderful thing because Arthur and Eleanor Roosevelt did not have a good relationship. Vandenberg had been such a caustic critic of Franklin Roosevelt that Eleanor really resented the attacks on her husband. And Eleanor was viewed by Vandenberg and a lot of other Republicans as sort of the liberal voice whispering in Franklin's ear. And they were, and with a lot of utopian ideas that drew their skepticism. And one of them, in fact, was for a planned community. She had several of those in West Virginia that was to have a cottage industry making furniture. And this, of course, is the senator from Grand Rapids who couldn't abide the notion of the federal government underwriting a furniture business. But they sailed together to Southampton, and after the first meeting of the General Assembly, Vandenberg writes to his friend John Foster Dulles and says, I take back everything I said about her, and it's been plenty. And she writes to Vandenberg urging him, she continued on as a delegate to the General Assembly, and she urged him to stay too. And he said, geez, I'd love to, but I've got to get back to my job in the Senate. But that it was so sort of heartwarming to see these old enemies come together in that time over the United Nations. And then more significantly, Vandenberg and Connally joined the new Secretary of State, James Burns, for conferences with foreign ministers in Paris through much of 1946 to negotiate peace treaties with countries such as Italy that had fought the war on the German side. 1946 was also the year that Look magazine published a profile of Vandenberg with a couple of lines that I can't resist sharing that get at some of the aspects of his influence. Every few months, wrote Look, several million people become grateful to Vandenberg for expressing their vague thoughts, such as what is Russia up to? And in fact, in the fall of 1945, after that General Assembly meeting and before the Paris peace conferences, Vandenberg writes a speech in the Senate. And of course, he was very proud of his speeches, as were so many senators, and they would print up stationery to send out copies of the speech with a title on the envelope. And this was "Raise the Iron Curtain." And he delivers this speech in the Senate in October of 1945. And his friend John Foster Dulles writes, great speech, too bad nobody heard it. It happened to be the same week, maybe the same day that Eisenhower returns triumphantly from Europe and has big parades, and that gets all the attention. But Dulles says, but I think the coinage will catch on, Iron Curtain. Well, it didn't until about 8 months later in the May of 1946 when Truman delivers his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. So neither one coined the phrase, but clearly Vandenberg, well, he gave the first speech in the U.S. to talk about it, didn't succeed in having it catch on with credit to him. But he was a master politician in his ability to be flexible and principled at the same time. And he had the credibility that went with the reformed sinner, with his conversion from isolationism. He'd always wanted to write a biography of St. Paul, although Vandenberg's conversion was a little more drawn out than that. But he was becoming something of an oracle on foreign policy. And Look said, it might take a whirling dervish to follow the pros and cons of Vandenberg's Senate votes over the past 18 years. But Vandenberg has whirled as the American people have whirled. Or as one of his fellow senators put it, Van changes his mind about as often as the average American, but slightly earlier. Now, I think there's sort of an understated genius in that idea of slightly earlier. It means that you're not so far out in front that you're a leader without followers, and he was certainly no visionary, but he could express and shape the temper of his times. He was also a fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Emerson says in his essay, Self-Reliance, speak what you now think in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, although it contradict everything you said today. Be ready to change and willing when the time is right. And that's what Vandenberg was doing, and bringing millions of anxious Americans who had previously shared his misgivings about foreign entanglements along with him. And that made a big difference when Truman asked for support of the Truman Doctrine, calling for the U.S. to help nations threatened by communist subversion. More specifically, he was supporting Truman when the president asked Americans to pick up the baton from the impoverished British and aid the governments of Greece and Turkey against Soviet pressure. It made all the difference when Secretary of State George Marshall proposed an unprecedented aid program to help the European democracies rebuild their shattered economies. Truman had the political sense to call this the Marshall Plan, after the revered general. Marshall said it could have been called the Vandenberg Plan because when it went to Congress, Van was just the whole show, quote unquote. He was a center of speculation at the Republican convention in 1948 as well, when it looked like whoever ran would beat Harry Truman. But of course, Thomas Dewey was wonderfully well organized. Vandenberg did not campaign. His wife Hazel had cancer already at that time. And Dewey again became the GOP nominee and of course was famously upset by President Truman. Meanwhile, Americans were learning that rebuilding the European economies was not enough. There was also the power vacuum left by the war and now being filled in Eastern Europe by the Soviet Red Army. The war-racked Western democracies formed a European Union for mutual defense and invited the Americans to join. Now this was the big one, an entangling alliance which Vandenberg had once so adamantly resisted. The Vandenberg Resolution, one page which he typed out himself, enabled American entry into the new North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It sailed through Congress with Vandenberg's leadership. And the skids had been greased for that by the UN Charter allowing regional security arrangements as a result of the Monroe Doctrine and as an alliance between the U.S. and its Latin neighbors. Nobody knew at the time that that would actually become the template for NATO to be created. These bipartisan majorities were his pride and joy. They began to fray about the time he was diagnosed in 1949 with lung cancer. After fighting fellow Republicans in the House to secure funding for NATO military aid, he was flown to Ann Arbor for an operation that removed half of his left lung. And as Mao Zedong and the communists emerged victorious in China, Vandenberg was headed back to his home in Grand Rapids, the one he'd built as a young editor in 1907. As he lay dying, he cherished the chatty notes he received from General Marshall, who reminisced about the days when Marshall's undersecretary, Robert Lovett, would come by the Vandenberg apartment after work, have a martini, and flesh out NATO and other significant initiatives. It would have been a great relaxer to sit down and have a drink with you and Bob Lovett and decide just how we were going to manage the world and then have done it, Marshall wrote. And Vandenberg replied, "Those were truly great days. Looking backward, it is really quite amazing how well we and the world got along together." But the times were changing. Not only had bipartisanship suffered amid recriminations over who lost China, but a young Republican senator from Wisconsin named McCarthy was fomenting fear with wild accusations of communists in the Truman administration. And war had broken out in Korea. The bipartisan bonds were coming apart, and Vandenberg was not there to patch them up. And that brings us full circle. When Vandenberg died in April 1951, his slide into relative obscurity began. News of his death was overshadowed by General Douglas MacArthur's address to a joint session of Congress. This is the day after Vandenberg dies. The general, so recently relieved of his command by President Truman, ended his speech to the joint session with a line about how old soldiers never die, they just fade away. But the eulogies began to pour in, with bipartisanship giving way to the McCarthy era and increasing polarization. Journalist Edward R. Murrow paid tribute to Vandenberg for his CBS radio audience with words that I'll wrap up with today. "We are now divided, bitterly, hysterically," Murrow observed, noting of Arthur Vandenberg, "had he lived, he would have gloried in this conflict and steadied it. And he would have been confident that at the end of the day, little men of loud voice and small faith will yield to the collective judgment of the American people." Thank you very much. And be delightful to entertain any questions or observations you have. Yes, sir. The question is, do we allow our politicians today to evolve? And everyone in this room would be as informed on that subject as I do. I think the answer is pretty much no. We go back and look at their voting record and say, you've been inconsistent. Yeah, you can't be trusted. You've changed your mind. And my gosh, don't we want politicians who are willing to change their mind? That seems so essential. But I think we make it awfully difficult for them. Yes, ma'am. It's a great question. Why was there a lack of Marshall Plan for Asia? I think you had a civil war breaking out in China, which I'm imagining, and I'm sure no expert, was the part of the challenge of the Marshall Plan was the sense that the individual nations would come forward with their needs and then agree collectively on what their needs were for aid. And there wasn't that kind of unity, or certainly from a Chinese standpoint, a capacity for agreement when you had forces jockeying for power there. There wasn't a unified society that could be dealt with that way. That would be one guess. You wonder were there racial implications? I don't know.
I'm talking about our allies, Philippines, Singapore, all the places that we just forgotten.
A great question. Yeah. Now Singapore, would the British have been hoping to reclaim that, and so it would have been in a different situation? Philippines, great question. Yeah, I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir. The question was in Vandenberg's political career, what kind of opposition did he face? How did he fare in terms of his political rise? He never faced really tough Democratic competitors. In his first election, though, he was fighting he was elected in 28 and then re-elected in 34. That was his closest election because, of course, Roosevelt was at his peak strength, and the Democrats absolutely decimated the Republicans in the 34 election. Vandenberg was the only senator from a northern or industrial state Republican to win re-election. In fact, I think there were like 17 Republicans left in the Senate, so it was a very small group, which of course accelerated his rise in the Senate hierarchy, and he won by 50,000 votes. It wasn't a big margin against a not particularly significant candidate, but withstood the Roosevelt landslide. And then in 1940, when he failed as a presidential candidate, he won re-election. The Republicans, the Democrats tried to persuade Roosevelt's Governor General of the Philippines, who had been a former governor of Michigan and mayor of Detroit, Frank Murphy, to come back and run against Vandenberg. But Murphy was hearing that it would be tough sledding and decided not to do that. And then, of course, later he became Roosevelt's Attorney General and then a member of the Supreme Court. And interestingly, he was getting data from a fellow from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan named Emil Hurja, H-U-R-J-A, who was who some people credit, and there was a book last year with inventing the science of polling. So Murphy's getting that information that, maybe it's not worth the fight. And then in 1946, Vandenberg only returned to Michigan and to Grand Rapids the night before the election. He had been in London or Paris or Washington the entire year. He didn't campaign at all, and he handily won re-election. And you wonder how much of that is how the institution of the Senate and the significance we attach to the legislatures has declined since then, that I think even though a lot of people would have disagreed with a lot of his politics, there was almost like a home state pride in this guy's a big cheese, and kind of nice to have somebody from from our neighborhood helping determine the fate of the world. And so, because he didn't campaign and did very well. And so, but then he never really had the fire in his belly. When you mentioned Wisconsin, he ran in the Wisconsin primary in 1940, and Dewey out-organized him and gave a lot of speeches, and Vandenberg was, didn't really want to work that hard. And so his presidential hopes were always to somehow be a compromise candidate who'd be drafted rather than do the slogging that the emergence of primaries was beginning to call for. Yes, sir. Can you contrast the satisfaction that comes with being an author from the satisfaction that comes with, I don't run our company, but being involved in a business? Never been asked that before. I think so, in the sense that the what you do in business with a team of people feels very incremental day to day, and I happen to love to write, and so this becomes something that is your own sort of, almost as a form of escape, I guess, but something that, and boy, this is a really personal digression I hadn't thought about. Well, so I'm in a family business, and so, your talents didn't necessarily get you where you are in the scope of the business, nor can you rely on people who you work with to say, that was really dumb. But I mean, I've got a couple of errors in this book. I have a Democratic gubernatorial candidate who was Fitzpatrick, and I've got Fitzgerald, which is confusing because there was a Republican governor named Fitzgerald. So there are errors there, but they're sort of, you own them, you're stuck with them, instead of being in a group that can do well together or fail together, but you're not likely to be judged in quite as objective a way. Thank you. Yes, sir. Are there people on the scene today or in recent history who would be in a comparable position to Vandenberg's? And now, of course, the opportunity has to be there, which is in a case, in Vandenberg's case, you had a Republican working with a Democratic administration, and one working with, and that creates the climate where there's an opportunity in a different way than if one party controls the executive branch and the legislative branch. And so in recent years, Frank and I were talking about this earlier, the Vandenberg's name would be invoked when George H.W. Bush was seeking congressional Senate approval for Desert Shield or Desert Storm, Desert Storm, and there was nobody in the Democratic side who seemed to be rallying bipartisan support. And then similarly, when Clinton intervened in the Balkans, there was, and in both these cases, the executive and the legislative were different. There was nobody on the Republican side who seemed to bring Republicans in a bipartisan way there. So those would have been the occasions when you would hear Vandenberg's name invoked. I think in terms of general political outlook, you get somebody like Richard Lugar when he chaired the Foreign Relations Committee, who would have had all the right instincts. But two things there. One, he wasn't as forceful a personality, perhaps, or carry as much credibility throughout the party as Vandenberg did. And then, of course, what happened to him? He got primaried, and so that too works against the possibility. It's like coming from Grand Rapids, people say, well, we talk about Vandenberg or President Ford, and could he be elected today? Well, sure, he could be elected, but he couldn't get nominated. That's the problem. So I think that's how I would think about it. Good question. Lindsey Graham's kind of a hard one to pin down, isn't he? I mean, I'm not sure where he's coming from sometimes. He would certainly seem to have some of those instincts, and I think Bob Corker may have some of those instincts. I'm not sure. Yes, ma'am. Question was Vandenberg's view on balance between liberalism and conservatism in the 30s and 40s, and a couple of different things there. I mean, he was a politician looking to get reelected, and so he would talk about the idea of one of his little catchphrases was Lincoln liberalism, and that we ought not to just be, and he was tired of being in reaction all the time. I mean, if you went to the Senate in 1928, and in pretty short order, the Democrats are, from 1930 on, you're having to be in reaction in many ways to growing Democratic majorities, and so he's looking for ways to cooperate to some degree, and I mean, this is a great question because he's got couple of things going on. The only way to have leverage when the Republicans are in such a small minority is to work with some Democrats, and in this case, in relation and reaction to Roosevelt, that's going to be some Southern Democrats, and so that, in some respects, is going to make him more conservative on domestic matters than he actually was out of that expedience, and then but he won re-election in Michigan because he was pretty adroit at agreeing with some of the New Deal measures, and so he would be focused less on a philosophical conservatism, unless it be about smaller government, than on what he viewed as New Deal excesses in spending. And so the Agricultural Adjustment Act he was a caustic critic of that. One of the little sidelights was, long before there was any particular environmental notion attached to it, he was Roosevelt's chief antagonist over Roosevelt's plan to build a ship canal across Florida, which was viewed by him as an important job creation project, and by Vandenberg as a government boondoggle, neither one really seeming to think real hard about what a ship canal across Florida would do to the Everglades and the environmental consequences of that. In the Republican caucus, he and Robert Taft had an interesting and uneasy relationship where the party generally deferred to him on foreign policy and to Taft on domestic policy. And of course, Taft was somewhat more conservative, so he's going along with Taft. So I think his impulse from a re-election standpoint was to be more moderate. His impulse in gathering votes in the Senate, whether it was in a coalition with anti-Roosevelt Democrats or in combination with Taft, would have pulled him more conservative. The last vote he voted in the Senate, he had his operation and then recuperated in Grand Rapids for a while, was hoping to go back to the Senate and returned to Washington in 1950 briefly, made one return visit to the Senate to cast a vote in favor of cloture on a filibuster against a Fair Employment Practices Act, one of Truman's early civil rights measures. And so that was his bias, but I would say expediency tended to mute him and have him defer to more conservative people when he was in for a lot of his time in the Senate. Well, and the question is, why did the Marshall Plan not include Russia? And if it had included Russia, how things might have been different? And yeah, that's a fascinating one, because it appears that the Russians were invited and came to the initial European conference on the Marshall Plan. It appears, and I don't know how cynical it was, but almost a bluff on the administration's part to invite the Russians to join, but if from the from Stalin's standpoint, it would have meant some degree of integration with the European market economies and some degree of openness about the state of the Russian economy. And so it would have been fascinating to listen to what the debate was in the Kremlin, because how could Stalin have agreed to open the books, so to speak, and also agree to trading arrangements with the other European countries without just sort of ideological disaster and a potential threat to his power? So I guess so the Russians go to the initial meeting and then balk at the requirements that the U.S. or the stipulations that the U.S. is putting on development of the aid program, and of course pull some of the Eastern European countries out with them. And I think much to the relief, in a sense, of the Americans, because then it's going to be a somewhat less costly and an easier sell in Congress. But I think at the same time, they did make the offer that Stalin just couldn't have accepted without changing without his own jeopardizing the course he saw for the Soviet Union. Thank you. Could we compare the America First movement pre-World War II with the fledgling America First movement we have today? They would both seem to tap into many of the same anxieties about the hazards of American entanglement in the world. And I mean, in that case, though, it was, again, initially grown out of student anti-war concerns, that you'd had a prior generation that had been, I mean, much more in Europe than with the US, but a prior generation that had seen young soldiers go off to war in Europe to no apparent purpose. I mean, here we were coming back 20 years later, and another war's about to happen. Where did we go wrong? Let's not make that mistake again. And it's coming out of that impulse, but then later it becomes a more accommodationist, willing to look the other way with Hitler's fascism, and is tainted that way. Today we don't have that student impulse of fear of war in the same way, although we do have the fatigue with American commitments in the Middle East, and it doesn't have the same. It hasn't taken on the same anti-Semitic overtones, but it has taken on some of the nativist overtones of we Americans, we don't want to have anything to do with these other people. So I think that would be there are and just a weariness about being engaged in the world when we've seen that world engagement hasn't delivered what we thought it would deliver. And so I think but that's a new, more economically driven, some of the same cultural overtones, but economically driven instead of anti-war driven, I would think.
Well, I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. This has been extraordinary.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.